Your Humanities Half-hour is brought to you by the Northern Marianas Humanities Council.
Hapedades and Tiro, welcome to your Humanities Half-hour. I'm Catherine Perry, and today we're coming to you from the shoreline in Majuro, Republic of the Marshall Islands. And we're sitting down today with a gentleman whose name may be familiar to you for his many roles as a writer and editor here in Micronesia, Mr. Giff Johnson. Giff, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to talk with you.
I remember when I graduated from college with a degree in broadcasting, started my career, and I would see your name appearing in the papers or magazines in Saipan. How is it you first ended up all the way out here in Majuro?
Well, it wasn't such a jump for me because my folks moved to Hawaii when I was pretty young in elementary school. So I grew up in Hawaii and then through good fortune also spent a few years in Fiji, which really got me connected in the region. And quite frankly, growing up in Hawaii doesn't mean you know anything about the Pacific Islands. But it was being in Fiji, connecting with people from different islands and getting clued in, particularly to the nuclear weapons test legacy of the United States in the Marshall Islands, which led me to start researching and writing about it and doing advocacy work with Marshall Islanders around the issue of trying to get justice for Marshall Islands nuclear test victims. And that's what led me to meet a beautiful young Marshallese lady. Well, she was older than I was, over a slideshow about nuclear weapons tests that I delivered in Honolulu to a high school and college group. And we hit it off, and 4 years after that, we were married on her home atoll of Wetje, which is north of Majuro. And then we moved out here in 1984. So that's the short story. The first time I came out was actually an island hop because I'd never been out here, and I'd started doing some research and work. I was starting to get to know people through communication. In those days, this was way before internet days, so we wrote letters.
Wow. And
telephone calls were $4 a minute, if you could even get through, because they would route you through the trust territory. It would go through Guam and then to the trust territory headquarters in Saipan, and then connect you down, and maybe you'd get a radio telephone to some guy in Koror or in Chuuk or wherever, and it would just be like you were talking to someone at the bottom of a well somewhere. So anyway, we wrote letters back in those days. But I did an island hop through, spent a little bit of time in Guam, visited Saipan, Tini, and Rota. First time I'd been out here, also down to Yap and Palau, and pretty much everywhere except Koshrai, because in those days Continental didn't service Koshrai, and the only way you could get there was by ship from Pohnpei, and I didn't get that organized, so I didn't get to Koshrai till much later. So I guess you could say I've been hanging around these parts since the mid-'70s.
There's a long list of publications that you've written for or been the editor for. How did you get into that line of work?
Well, it really came from my parents. My dad was a university professor at the University of Chicago and the University of Hawaii, American history, wrote a lot of books. And my mother, both of them were political, social activists, very involved in the civil rights movement in the mainland before they moved to Hawaii or before we went out. And so my mother was a writer, editor. My dad wrote books. And so it just was kind of a natural progression. So I worked as a contributor with Pacific Magazine from just shortly after it started in the mid-'70s, and later on ended up for a bit as a managing editor and contributing editor until its unfortunate demise in the late 2000s. And I mean, Islands Business magazine in Fiji, and I string for a number of news services like Radio New Zealand, Radio Australia, Marianas Variety. I've written for the Marianas Variety for a long time. and also the Mariana's Business Journal, and then from time to time some other publications.
I guess the question I should have asked is, are there any regional publications you haven't written for?
Well, it just shows that there aren't too many people up in this neck of the woods, so, and it's just, part of the problem actually is because there are many news agencies that are competing, and they say, hey, can you write something? And I say, well, I string for one, I can't write for another one. So frankly, it would be great to have more people up here writing, but generally in the FSM, Federated States of Micronesia, Marshall Islands, there are very few people in a journalism role. I mean, there are some, but we could certainly use more.
Take us back to the day when you first started in journalism here in Micronesia. Nowadays, we've got the internet, can get that message out there in a few seconds. What was the process back in those days?
To get news, particularly from government, because government in these small islands is really the driver of the economy, the driver of pretty much everything. You, as a newspaper reporter, I had to get to know people really well, and it was like you can't just walk. It's very difficult to just walk into a small town and start getting decent stories, because first of all, people want to know, who is this person, what's their, who are they connected to, what's their political affiliation, and I think this is one of the challenges particularly in a small place is. Small islands are very factionalized, and it's mostly based on family relations, like which family are you connected to. But then there's broader political affiliations, and those things affect how people will look at you or deal with you, whether they feel comfortable. And one of the things that we've done, and that my publisher from the day he started the Marshall Islands Journal, was to make it really clear that the newspaper was not taking sides politically. We don't endorse candidates, for example. We cover candidates, we cover campaigns, but we don't endorse. And part of that is just there's no value in it. I mean, let people make up their own minds. And if you have enough information out, people can talk about it, think about it, and make their own minds up. But it just, in a really small place, if you start hammering away, if you're in media, and you hammer away too much on one side, then you just can't talk to people on the other 5 or 6 or 8 sides, because there's never 2 sides in an island. Yes. There's always many, and you need to be aware of these things. So I'd say my challenge was getting to know the subtleties of people's connections, who was married to who's relative, how does that play out in news and so on. But over time, if you treat people fairly, I've found that people, even they may not like something coming out in the paper, but if you treat them fairly and they have access to the paper so they can say their piece as well as somebody criticizing them or say an audit report or whatever, like they can have their say in the paper, they're comfortable with that. And to me, that's the most important thing of running that line down the middle to make sure that people do have access to the newspaper. And of course we have opinions. And of course we say if we see something that's not right, we talk about it. And that often rubs people the wrong way. And there'll be people who 1 week to the next might say, oh, that newspaper, they're why are they talking like that? But they can put their comments in too. And I think that's just been the lesson I've learned is talk to people, get to know people, and if you've got something critical, be sure you talk to the person who's getting criticized. Make the effort to pull them in, and if they don't want to comment, fine, but at least they know it's coming out.
So I know it's hard to pick one, but of the many issues that you've covered, which do you feel has been, if not most important, then at least most meaningful to you in covering?
Probably issues related to nuclear in one way or another, not necessarily all related to the nuclear weapons test legacy, although that's significant and remains a big outstanding issue for the Marshall Islands because only partial compensation has actually been provided, and there are a lot of issues about medical care and treatment for survivors and related questions. But also the Marshalls went through a very long period in the 80s and 90s where nuclear waste storage was under consideration, and there were all kinds of proposals being bandied about store high-level waste, store low-level waste, do it on Bikini or Eniwetok, the former nuclear test sites, because they're already contaminated. So take a place that's contaminated and turn it into an asset, and a liability to an asset, things like that. And those generated huge concern in the community, but also a lot of news and ongoing for years. I mean, it just kept up and down. You know, as soon as one finished, a year or two would go by, and then there'd be another proposal. Oh, we'll pay you $2 billion a year, and everybody go, oh, look at $2 billion a year, and, or something. Anyway, in the late 90s, the government here finally issued a cabinet directive saying nuclear waste is officially off the table. We're not considering that anymore. And I think now that we're in the age of climate change and sea level rise, it really begs the question of, well, imagine if people were putting in storage facilities for nuclear waste, and we're talking about sea level rising, however much it may rise, and in fact, we already have one nuclear waste storage facility at Eniwetok Atoll, which is on an island called Runit, and it's called the Runit Dome. And it's actually become quite famous in the last few years because there's been a lot of international media attention. The dome is what they did was in the late 70s, the U.S. Army was dispatched to clean up Eniwetok. And Eniwetok was one of the 2 nuclear weapons test sites. So they sent the Army out, and they decided, because the northern half of this circular atoll was too contaminated, just too irradiated, they said, well, we can't touch it, don't even want to get near it. So they cleaned up the southern islands. Now remember, these are all islands that are connected by a reef and circle a lagoon. So they cleaned up the southern islands to allow Eniwetok Islanders to move back. And they used a crater, a nuclear test crater on the reef, a huge hole essentially, as a dump for all the material they scraped off these islands. Dirt, sand, concrete, rebar, all radioactive, all dangerous. Dumped it in, no lining or anything, dumped it into this pool, filled it up, and then capped it with concrete. And it's it looks like a flying saucer dropped into Eniwetok. Anyway, if people are interested, there's plenty of video and news shows about the Runit Dome. But point is, we already have that, right? And we know that the Eniwetok Lagoon, probably very much like the Bikini Lagoon floor, is laced with plutonium and other radioactive contaminants. Generally speaking, it just sits there, but if you get a typhoon or a tropical storm, it churns up the lagoon water, recirculates all that good stuff. And so, it just points out why the folly of all this discussion 20, 30 years ago about creating nuclear waste storage sites out on little tiny islands, because we still have a problem with our nuclear waste from the nuclear tests in the 50s.
Do you feel that these issues of nuclear waste and climate change are affecting your life personally, and if so, how?
Clearly, the nuclear weapons test has affected me as part of being part of a larger Marshallese family. My first wife, who was an outspoken advocate for justice for nuclear victims, she died at a very early age from breast cancer. Her mother had breast cancer. Her father had breast cancer, very unusual occurrence. They lived on islands that were downwind of the nuclear tests in the 50s, but which are not officially acknowledged by the U.S. government as affected, even though U.S. government documents show that they received hazardous amounts of nuclear fallout from the weapons tests in the 50s. So, I mean, I've seen that, and any family you talk to here has people in their family who've died of cancer, of various things. And of course, you cannot say that every cancer is caused by exposure to fallout, but the fact that we had 2 nuclear weapons test sites in this country close by just is an additional risk factor that essentially everybody here face. So that's on that side. In terms of climate, you know, people ask me often about out-migration because people from the Marshall Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia, and maybe to a lesser extent Palau, maybe just because there are fewer Palauans altogether, but FSM and the Marshall Islands heavily have moved to the U.S., Hawaii, and the mainland. And so often media people say, well, are they moving because of climate stress and so on? And my observation is up to now, the answer is no. The migration has not been related to climate, but it very well could become so very soon. Mostly the migration is people looking for jobs, for education, better education for their children, and older people for health care that they can't receive out here. The fact that we have no cancer treatment program in the Marshall Islands where we had a nuclear testing conducted, just says, well, if you get cancer, like my first wife, we had to go to Hawaii for her to get treatment. Couldn't do it here. And that's the situation that a lot of Marshall Islanders are in, and same with Micronesia. But what I notice, like thinking about having been here now over 35 years, we have always had ocean inundation. This is an atoll, okay? We are, people say 2 meters above sea level, so 6 feet or 6.5 feet above sea level. Well, there aren't a whole lot of places here that are actually 6 feet above sea level. And a lot of places here, at the high tide are actually like a foot out of the water, maybe 18 inches or 2 feet at high tide. So so we've always had some coastal inundation going way back. I mean, it's through history. In the last 4 or 5 years, 6, maybe even more than that, maybe like from mid-2000s, so maybe as many as 8 or 10 years, we're seeing coastal inundation repeatedly, like 10, 20 times in a month or two. Like during the high tide period, we'll get coastal inundation just every high tide. But now these aren't ones that are bringing waves over the island, and they're not causing huge damage, but it's what we call nuisance flooding. So like that kicks up rocks and coral and garbage onto the road, so the government's got to get bulldozers out usually and clean off the road. And I mean, you can still drive around and all that. So mostly it's nuisance stuff, right? But we can see it, and now there's a University of Hawaii website and program that actually tracks ocean inundation out here, and they've got wave buoys in various places throughout, not just Marshall Islands, but elsewhere. So you can actually see it and get a warning, like they'll put an alert up maybe a week or two ahead when they have a forecast that there'll be a high tide and it could result in inundation. And we see those now quite regularly, especially like January, February, March period, where we always get higher tides. But then if we have a storm and you get that combined with just a normal high tide, it can just push the water right over parts of the island. And that's just become more and more of a fact of life here.
Our guest today is Giff Johnson, and we'll be back after this break.
Did you know that you can donate up to $5,000 to the Humanities Council through the CNMI Education Tax Credit Program? Donations from individuals and corporations qualify and can be used to offset your local wage and salary tax, BGRT, and earnings tax. Call our office at 235-4785 to see how you can support humanities programs in our community and obtain a tax credit for your donation. Sizu Usmaasi, Olomai, and thank you.
Welcome back to your Humanities Half Hour. Giff, you mentioned your first wife who passed away, and you actually have written a book about her and several other books. Can you share with us what your publications are about?
Sure. I got started doing publications maybe 30, well, I have to keep adding years onto this calculation, but the first one I did that was kind of a bit, first book I did was called Collision Course at Kwajalein, Marshall Islanders in the Shadow of the Bomb, and it focused heavily on Kwajalein and Ebi and the whole missile testing, with a little bit on the nuclear weapons program and so on. And then, more recently, I did Nuclear Past, Unclear Future, which is a chronology of nuclear testing, and also basically a essay about the lack of justice for Marshall Islanders as a result of the nuclear testing, and the problem that people have had getting full compensation and medical care and so on that's needed. The problem they've had getting it from the U.S. government, in spite of getting some, but not getting the full amount and the broad coverage of medical care that's needed. Then more recently, I wrote a biography about my first wife, Darlene Keju, who was an outspoken person on the nuclear weapons testing program. And in fact, she was a person who helped to break silence about the weapons testing back in the 80s, before a lot was really known about the testing, and 10 or 15 years before the U.S. government released thousands and thousands and thousands of classified documents. And those declassified documents showed how spot on her comments were as a person who had gone to the northern islands here, which are the downwind islands to the nuclear test sites, interviewed Marshall Islanders about their experience, their health problems, and it tells you something about people living in their environment. They know what's going on in their islands. They can see subtle changes over time, like if plants don't propagate properly, or if suddenly you've got all these people getting sick and various things happening. And, back in the 70s, well, from 1954, when the U.S. conducted the Bravo tests, this was the largest U.S. hydrogen bomb ever tested by the United States at Bikini Atoll. It irradiated many people, but it particularly affected a group called the people from Rongelap Atoll. And the people from Rongelap were evacuated, and the people from another atoll called Utrecht, who were less affected but seriously affected still, were evacuated, and then they were subject to follow-up medical studies and so on. And essentially, the U.S. government scientists and doctors told the lesser exposed Utrecht people, don't worry, we're going to be here, we'll monitor you, but you didn't get a really big exposure, so don't worry too much, you're not going to be too badly off. Meanwhile, the Rongelap people were having, an epidemic of thyroid tumors and then related cancers, and people were getting surgery, and that was all going on. Well, suddenly in the mid-1970s, 22 years after Bravo, there was a spike in the cancer rate among the Utrecht people, such that at that time it equaled per capita the Rongelap people who had been exposed to 10 times more radiation. And it was like the U.S. doctors and scientists still were they couldn't understand it. And the Utrecht people, of course, were outraged because they'd been led to believe that,
they were fine.
Right. But this essentially gives you a little snapshot of how the U.S. government and its scientists and doctors ran their programs out here in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And it wasn't until people really started advocating and complaining and demanding changes that some changes began to be made and better medical care was provided and so on. Anyway, Darlene got in on this in the late 70s, early 80s. Darlene went on to get a public health degree at the University of Hawaii. and came back here and dived into community health development. And she established a non-government group called Youth to Youth in Health, which I'm happy to say over 20 years after she died is still here, is still functioning, doing health programs for young people. And this, at the time, and still today, was really the only group focused on young people's health and interests. And her model was to uplift young people through pride in their culture and identity as the first step to making them functioning people in their community. Because you got kids who are like young people, they get drugs and alcohol. I mean, they're exposed to all these things, right? Drugs and alcohol and just like, well, nowadays everybody's on Facebook and whatnot, but in those days everybody was watching videos and stuff, and it was just like you wanted to be American. I mean, that was the thinking. Like, you're living in the march of, oh, I want to be like those people I see on TV, but you're not getting enough English in school to really compete. If you go to America, meantime, you've forgotten, you don't know anything about your own place, your own roots. So Darlene just said, this is the way to do it. Got people trained up, used music and dance and drama, and just created this incredible model that worked. And it was youth to youth, right? Youth to youth in health, but it was young people to young people. And she understood that, of course, that brings the parents in because they want to know about their kids, the grandparents, so you got the whole community. And her program became internationally recognized by groups like the World Health Organization and others for just an incredible array of community development initiatives that not only addressed youth leadership and health issues, but then led on to income generating programs, women programs, a whole range of things. I mean, Darlene was really a visionary everything she did was before her time, because like her speaking out about the nuclear testing, like today, everybody talks like Darlene talked 30 years ago. But when she said it in those days, she was attacked, right? But now it's just, that's how everybody thinks, because they know it's true what she was saying. Well, anyway, so she died in 1996 because of cancer. And so a few years ago, I decided I have to write a book about her. So I did, and I called it Don't Ever Whisper. I got this Don't Ever Whisper title from one of the young women in the program who told this story about her first day or two in the program. Because what Darlene did was they recruited young people, and they had a 2 or 3 week seminar where they just transformed these young people into different people. There's no other way to say it. But anyway, it required participation, right? You didn't sit in the back of the room and just listen to somebody talking. So they're in a circle to say a closing prayer at the end of the day. And so this girl is telling me the story. She says, I'm thinking to myself, please, don't pick me. I don't want to say the prayer. Not because she couldn't, but just she's too shy, right? Yeah. She's embarrassed. Yeah. So, of course, Darlene picks her. And she's like, oh, no. Darlene says, please say the prayer for us. So she said, it took me like 2 or 3 minutes just to start talking. But everybody waited. And so she finally said the prayer. And then Darlene said, I'm sorry we couldn't hear you. Say it again. And so she had to say it again because she just mumbled it the first time. So I don't know if maybe she had said it 2 or 3 times, but finally she said it in a way that was acceptable to Darlene. And Darlene in her inimitable fashion didn't make this a negative, right? It wasn't like you say this or right? It was just we're all in it together and everybody does this. But anyway, when it was done, Darlene looked at her and said, so this is the message you need to take from this is that if you don't talk loud, nobody will know what you're thinking and what your needs are. Don't ever whisper because people won't know what you need then. And it's like the title of the book was born. And that really defines what Darlene's leadership development was all about here. It was about empowering young folks, both women and men, to get their feet on the ground so that they could make decisions. And she felt if people were solid in their own culture, it didn't matter if they practiced it like as their job or whatever, but if they were comfortable with who they are as Pacific Islanders, then they would be competent to deal with whatever came along, and they could engage on an equal basis, on an equal playing field.
If you could leave a parting thought, call to action, words of advice, whatever you want to call it, to our listeners from your perspective, what would it be?
You know, there's been a lot of interest that I'm aware of in Guam and even in the Northern Marianas about the nuclear test legacy, which has resulted in representatives from Guam pushing the U.S. Congress to try to get recognition for Guam in compensation programs as well. And what I would say is that there are many outstanding justice issues for people who were exposed to U.S. nuclear weapons tests, to people who were engaged to go onto these islands to clean them up. And those were Americans, they were Marshallese, they were Filipinos, there were Palauans, there were probably people from Guam, there were certainly people from Hawaii. And a lot of these folks are today they're just faceless. Nobody knows who they are, but they were out being exposed to radiation from nuclear tests at a time when people were just, everything's okay, don't worry about it. But today, we know so much more about it. And the fact that the U.S. government continues to, I guess you could say, implement Cold War era policy that prevents a reasonable compensation, medical care, nuclear cleanup program to be conducted in all the islands for all the people who need it and who merit whether it's compensation or medical care. And this includes veterans. I mean, the people in the Army who went to Enewetak in the late 70s from Schofield Barracks in Hawaii, I mean, up until just a few months ago, they were ineligible to get medical care for cancers and things that they believe happened as a result of exposure during the cleanup at Enewetak, the nuclear test site. And just in the last year, the U.S. Congress has adopted legislation making Enewetak veterans specifically eligible. So we are seeing some of these justice issues get acted on, and it's never too late for them to happen. I mean, of course, it's very late in the day now. Many people have died, in the process. But I think the recognition of people in Guam that, yes, there was fallout in that direction. That includes presumably islands in the FSM. I mean, but if you talk to people in the U.S. government, well, that was just, very low dose and it was inconsequential. But the fact of the matter is we don't know that. And what we can say from the Marshall Islands is even people who had relatively low dose by U.S. government standards have had health issues and have had problems and concerned about this. So I would say those are things that definitely merit ongoing action by people who particularly people who have congressional representation and have some ability to lobby and affect things with the U.S. Congress.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. Our guest has been journalist, editor, author Giff Johnson, stationed in the Marshall Islands. Thank you so much, Giff, for sharing your thoughts.
My pleasure. Thank you.
This has been your Humanities Half Hour. I'm Catherine Perry.
This program was supported by a We the People grant awarded to the Northern Marianas Humanities Council from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities or the Northern Marianas Humanities Council.